Some wounds never heal, they just learn to hide beneath the surface until something breaks them wide open again. When giant ranch hand Bon Ransom found a mute girl eating from his trash, his heart shattered all over again. The child was maybe 12 years old, barefoot and bruised, desperately searching for food scraps behind his cabin. She couldn't speak a word, but her frightened eyes told him everything. This little girl was running from something terrible. Bon had been alone for years, carrying the grief of losing his own daughter. Now here was another lost child who needed him. He took her in, and slowly they began to heal each other through small acts of kindness. But someone was looking for this girl, someone who would stop at nothing to get her back. What had this innocent child seen that made her so dangerous? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Texas sun had no mercy, never did. It beat down on the cracked earth of Bon Ransom's failing ranch like the fist of an angry god, turning everything brown and brittle. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered mesquite trees that looked more dead than alive. This was frontier country, the kind of place where dreams came to die and men learned to live with disappointment. Bon stood 6 feet 8 inches in his worn boots, a mountain of a man with hands like tree trunks and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. But these days, those shoulders sagged with the burden of memory. At 52, his dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and lines etched deep around his brown eyes spoke of too many sunrises spent alone. His cabin squatted low against the landscape, weathered wood and rusted tin that had seen better decades. The porch sagged in the middle where the supports had given way, and the screen door hung askew on broken hinges. It wasn't much, but it was his. It had been his and Sarah's anyway. His and Sarah's and little Emma's. The dented tin coffee cup sat on his kitchen table, the same spot it had occupied every morning for the past 7 years. Bon picked it up with fingers that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of ritual. This cup had been Sarah's favorite, the one she'd drink from while humming gospel songs and fixing breakfast. Now it was just another reminder of what he'd lost. He poured the bitter coffee, black as his mood most mornings, and walked out to the porch. The town of Dust Creek lay 5 miles south, barely a smudge on the horizon. Once upon a time it had been a thriving cattle town. Now it was dying slow, just like everything else out here. The railroad had moved on. The cattle drives were history, and young folks fled to the cities faster than tumbleweeds in a windstorm. Bon remembered when this land had purpose, when he'd worked cattle with his father, when he'd brought Sarah here as a new bride, full of dreams about raising a family, when Emma had taken her first steps right here on this porch, giggling as she stumbled into his waiting arms, but fever had taken them both in the space of a week, 8 winters ago. For Sarah, burning up despite all the cool cloths and desperate prayers. Then Emma, his precious 5-year-old angel, following her mama wherever souls go when bodies give out. Bon had buried them in the small cemetery behind the house, under twin cottonwood trees that had grown tall in the years since. He'd thought about joining them more than once, had even loaded his father's old revolver and sat with it on dark nights when the loneliness felt like barbed wire wrapped around his chest. But something always stopped him. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe it was the faint hope that God had more work for him to do. Or maybe he was just too stubborn to quit. The sound of rustling behind his cabin broke the morning quiet. Probably raccoons again, getting into the trash he'd forgotten to secure. Bon sighed and set down his coffee cup, the tin making a hollow ring against the porch rail. He walked around back, his boots crunching on the dry grass. What he found there stopped him cold. A child huddled next to his overturned trash barrel, small hands frantically stuffing something into her mouth. She was maybe 12 years old, all sharp angles and desperate hunger. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a face smudged with dirt and streaked with old tears. The dress she wore, if you could call the torn, filthy rag a dress, had once been yellow, but was now the color of mud and misery. But it was her feet that broke his heart. Bare and bloody, crisscrossed with cuts from rocks and thorns. She'd been walking for days, maybe weeks, running from something or someone. When she saw him, she froze like a rabbit caught in lamplight. Those eyes, God Almighty, those eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, wide with terror and something else. Something that looked like grief older than her years, should have allowed. "Easy there, little one," Bond said, his voice rusty from disuse. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl scrambled backward, clutching what looked like a moldy biscuit to her chest. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her lips moved silently, forming words that died in her throat. Bond's chest tightened. The way she held herself, the way she flinched from his movement. Someone had hurt this child. Hurt her bad enough to steal her voice and send her fleeing across the wasteland with nothing but the rags on her back. "You hungry?" he asked, crouching down to make himself less imposing. "I've got fresh bread inside. Real food." She stared at him with those storm cloud eyes, trying to decide if he was another danger or maybe possibly hope. Bond stayed perfectly still, the way he'd learned to do with spooked horses. Sometimes the most skittish ones just needed to see you weren't a threat. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the girl took a tentative step forward, then another. Her small hand reached out toward him, fingers trembling like autumn leaves. "That's it," Bond whispered. "I'm Bon Ransom. What's your name?" She opened her mouth again, trying so hard to speak that her whole body shook with the effort. But still no words came. Tears started fresh down her dirty cheeks, and she touched her throat with one small hand. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't shyness or stubbornness. Something had happened to this child's voice. Whether from trauma or injury, she couldn't speak. Couldn't tell him who she was, or where she'd come from, or what hell she was running from. "It's all right," he said, standing slowly. "You don't need to tell me anything right now. Let's just get you fed and cleaned up. Then we'll figure out the rest." He walked toward the cabin, stopping every few steps to make sure she was following. She was, but at a distance, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. It took 10 minutes to coax her up the porch steps and another 5 to get her through the front door. Inside, Bond busied himself with breakfast, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. He sliced thick pieces from yesterday's loaf of bread, spread them with butter and honey, and poured a glass of milk. The girl stood by the door, ready to run, watching his every move. When he set the plate on the table and stepped back, she crept forward like a wild creature approaching a trap. The first bite she took tentatively, as if expecting poison. The second bite was hungrier. By the third, she was devouring the bread like she hadn't eaten in days. While she ate, Bond studied her face. Beneath the dirt and fear, she was a pretty child with delicate features and intelligent eyes. Her hands, though small, moved with surprising grace. This wasn't a street child or a drifter's daughter. Someone had cared for her once, taught her manners, maybe even loved her. So where were they now? And why was she alone, mute and terrified in the middle of nowhere? As if sensing his scrutiny, the girl looked up from her meal. For a moment, their eyes met across the small kitchen table, and Bond saw something that nearly brought him to his knees. She looked at him the same way Emma used to look at him when she was scared or hurt, with complete trust that he would make everything better. The tin coffee cup sat between them. Sarah's cup, catching the morning light that streamed through the dusty windows. Bond reached for it with one weathered hand and slowly pushed it across the table toward the girl. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at him with those storm cloud eyes that seemed far too old for her face, without a word, because she had no words to give. She wrapped her small fingers around the cup and took a sip of the lukewarm coffee. It was bitter and strong, nothing like what a child should drink, but she didn't make a face. She just held the cup like it was precious, like it was a gift, and maybe it was. Maybe they were gifts to each other. Two broken souls, finding shelter in this weathered cabin at the edge of the world. Outside, the Texas sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. But inside Bon Ransom's kitchen, something had shifted. Something had begun. The first tentative threads of connection stretched between a grieving man who'd forgotten how to hope, and a lost child who'd forgotten how to speak. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were about to save each other's lives. That first night, the child's screams nearly drove Bon from his own home. He'd given her Emma's old room, the one he'd kept exactly as it was 8 years ago, with the small bed and patchwork quilt Sarah had sewn by lamplight. The girl had accepted the space with wide eyes and careful steps, touching nothing, as if she were afraid her presence might break something precious. But when darkness fell and the oil lamps were extinguished, the terror came. The screaming started around midnight, not words, because she had none to give, but raw sounds of anguish that seemed torn from the depths of hell itself. Bon found her thrashing in the small bed, eyes squeezed shut, fighting invisible demons in her sleep. "Easy, child," he whispered, but when he reached out to wake her, she recoiled so violently she tumbled to the floor. Even unconscious, she knew the touch of violence. He spent the rest of the night in the doorway, keeping watch while she whimpered and shook. Every now and then she'd call out, not words, but sounds that might have been names if her voice still worked. Always the same pattern, a deep sound that could have been Papa, and a higher one that might have been Mama. Dawn brought no peace, only exhaustion. The girl sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. In the morning light, Bon could see the full extent of what had been done to her. The bruises on her arms were finger-shaped, adult fingers, pressed too hard into tender skin. There were rope burns around her wrists, mostly healed but still visible. And when she moved, she favored her left side like her ribs had been cracked and mended wrong. Bon's jaw clenched. He'd seen enough injured animals to recognize systematic cruelty. This wasn't the result of an accident or even a single moment of rage. Someone had hurt this child deliberately, repeatedly, over time. While she picked at the breakfast he'd prepared, Bon examined her few belongings. The torn dress was all she had, except for a small cloth bundle tied with string. Inside, he found the scrap of fabric that made his blood run cold. It was a piece of a child's dress, fine material, expensive lace trim, but stained dark with what could only be blood. The fabric was silk, the kind only wealthy folks could afford. And there was something embroidered in the corner, partially torn away, but still legible. K.E. initials. This child had a name that started with those letters, and she'd come from money. Real money. The kind that attracted attention from the wrong sort of people. The sound of hoofbeats outside interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he saw a man on horseback approaching the cabin. Tall, thin, wearing a deputy's badge that caught the morning sun. Charlie Mason, the law from Dust Creek, and not someone who made social calls this far out. "Stay here," Bon told the girl, who immediately shrank back into the corner of the kitchen. "Don't let him see you." Deputy Mason was a nervous man with pale eyes and hands that shook when he thought nobody was looking. He'd held his badge for less than a year, appointed after the previous sheriff died of drink, and everybody knew he was in over his head. "Morning, Bon," Mason called as he dismounted. "Mind if I come up?" "Free country," Bon replied, though he didn't step aside from the doorway. "What brings you out this way?" "Got a wire from the county seat yesterday. They're looking for a missing child, girl, about 12 years old, dark hair. Might be traveling on foot." Mason pulled a crumpled telegram from his vest pocket. "Says she's dangerous, might be carrying disease or some such. Orders are to detain her for questioning." Every instinct Bon had developed in 40 years of frontier living started screaming danger. A wire about a dangerous child who might be carrying disease. That was the kind of lie you told when you wanted someone brought in quiet, no questions asked. "Haven't seen any children," he said, keeping his voice level. "What's this girl supposed to have done?" "Doesn't say exactly. Just that she's wanted in connection with some kind of incident back east. Rich family involved, apparently." Mason folded the telegram carefully. "You sure you haven't seen anything? Even from a distance?" "Deputy, if there was a child wandering around out here, don't you think I'd have mentioned it? This is dangerous country for a grown man, let alone a little girl." Behind him, through the thin walls of the cabin, Bon heard the soft creak of floorboards. The girl was moving, probably finding a better place to hide. He hoped she had sense enough to stay quiet. Course, Mason said, but his pale eyes kept darting toward the cabin windows. Mind if I take a look around? Just to be thorough? I mind plenty, Bon replied, and something in his voice made the deputy take a step back. This is my property, deputy. You got a warrant? Now, Bon, no need to get hostile. I'm just doing my job. Your job is to serve the people of Dust Creek, not hunt down lost children for whoever sent that wire. Bon crossed his arms, making himself even more imposing. You want to search my property, you come back with proper papers. Mason's hand drifted toward the gun at his hip, then seemed to think better of it. Bon was twice his size and had a reputation for being handy in a fight, back when there were still fights worth having. This isn't over, the deputy said, mounting his horse. That wire came from some very important people. They're offering a substantial reward for information leading to this girl's capture. Capture, not rescue, capture. As if she were a criminal instead of a terrified child. After Mason rode away, Bon found the girl huddled in Emma's closet, pressed against the back wall behind his daughter's old dresses. The sight of her there, small and frightened among the faded cotton and lace, nearly broke his heart all over again. He's gone, Bon said softly. You're safe. She looked up at him with those storm cloud eyes, and he saw she understood more than he'd realized. This child knew exactly what that deputy's visit meant. She knew someone was hunting her, and she knew that hiding places didn't stay safe for long. Bon knelt down in front of the closet, studying her face. She was trying so hard to be brave, but he could see the terror underneath. Whatever she'd witnessed, whatever she'd survived, it was bad enough to send powerful people after her. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. And I need you to be honest with me, even if you can't speak. Can you nod or shake your head? She nodded once, quick and sharp. Are you running from someone who hurt you? Another nod, this one accompanied by tears. Did you see something you weren't supposed to see? The longest pause yet. Then a slow, deliberate nod that told him everything he needed to know. This child was a witness to something terrible, something worth killing for. And now she was his responsibility, hidden in his cabin while the law itself came looking for her. Bon made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He'd failed to protect Sarah and Emma from the fever that took them, but he would not fail this lost child. Whatever she'd seen, whatever danger she represented, he would stand between her and the world. My name is Bon Ransom, he said formally, as if he were making a vow. And I promise you this, nobody is going to hurt you while you're under my roof. Nobody. She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly reached out one small hand. Her fingers were cold as winter morning, but they gripped his with surprising strength. For the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. It was a tiny thing, barely there, but it transformed her entire face. Suddenly, she looked less like a victim and more like what she actually was. A brave little girl who'd survived the unsurvivable and was still fighting. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another hard night. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Bon Ransom was no longer just a grieving widower waiting for his life to end. He was a protector again, a guardian, a man with purpose, and the girl, well, she was no longer just a victim on the run. She was his responsibility now, his to shelter and defend. Whatever name she'd carried before, whatever life she'd fled, she belonged here now. As if reading his thoughts, she pointed to herself and then to him, her eyes asking a question. What should I call you? Bon asked, understanding. She considered this, then pointed toward the window where the first drops of rain were starting to fall. She made a gesture with her hands, like something growing toward the light. Hope, he suggested. Her smile bloomed wider and she nodded enthusiastically. Hope. It was a good name, a strong name. A name for someone who'd survived the darkness and was ready to step into the light. Hope it is then, Bon said, and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen for 8 long years was finally beginning to thaw. The rain began in earnest now, drumming against the tin roof like the fingers of all the ghosts he'd been carrying. But for the first time in memory, Bon wasn't listening to the voices of the dead. He was listening to the quiet breathing of a living child who trusted him to keep her safe, and by God he would. Whatever it cost him, whatever it took, he would keep that promise. The torn dress scrap lay on his kitchen table, those initials KE staring up at him like an accusation. Tomorrow, he would figure out what they meant, who was hunting Hope, and why they wanted her badly enough to involve crooked deputies and substantial rewards. Tonight, though, he would simply stand guard while a brave little girl named Hope tried to sleep without nightmares in Emma's old bed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Bon Ransom's cabin, two lost souls had found each other at last. 3 days passed before Hope ate a full meal without looking toward the door. Bon watched her slowly relax into the rhythm of his simple life. Coffee at dawn, chores in the morning cool, a midday rest when the sun grew too fierce, then more work until darkness fell. She followed him everywhere like a shadow, never more than arm's reach away, learning his routines and finding her place in them. She was smart, maybe too smart for her own good. When he mucked out the horse stalls, she figured out how to hold the gate. When he mended fence, she handed him nails before he asked. And when he sat on the porch after supper, she curled up beside him like a cat seeking warmth. The nightmares came every few nights, but they were getting shorter. Sometimes now she'd wake herself up before the worst of it hit, and he'd find her sitting by the window, staring out at the darkness with those storm cloud eyes. "Bad dreams?" he'd ask, and she'd nod. "Want to talk about them?" He'd try, knowing she couldn't but hoping anyway. She'd always shake her head and pat his hand, as if comforting him instead of the other way around. It was on the 4th morning that she discovered Emma's room held more than just a bed and dresser. While Bon was outside checking the well pump, Hope found the wooden box under the bed, the one that held his daughter's few treasures. He came back to find her sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding a small wooden horse in her hands. The carving was crude, whittled by his own clumsy fingers during the long winter nights when Emma had been sick with pneumonia the year before the fever took her. She'd loved that little horse, carried it everywhere, made up elaborate stories about its adventures in magical kingdoms far from the harsh frontier. Hope looked up when Bon appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with question and something that might have been longing. "That belonged to my daughter," he said quietly, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Emma. She died 8 years ago." Hope set the horse down carefully, as if it were made of glass instead of pine wood. She started to push it back toward the box, but Bon caught her hand. "No," he said. "She'd want you to have it. Emma never could stand to see anyone sad or lonely. She'd have liked you, I think." The smile that crossed Hope's face was like sunrise after the longest night. She hugged the wooden horse to her chest, then reached up and touched Bon's cheek with one small hand. Her fingers came away wet. He hadn't realized he was crying. That afternoon, they made their first trip to town together. Bon had put it off as long as he could, but supplies were running low, and Hope needed proper clothes. The rags she'd arrived in had been fit only for burning, and Emma's old dresses were too small and too painful for Bon to see every day. "Stay close," he told her as they approached Dust Creek's dusty main street. "Don't wander off, and if anyone asks you questions, you just point to me." Hope nodded solemnly, clutching the wooden horse in one hand and Bon's shirt sleeve with the other. Dust Creek had seen better decades. Half the storefronts stood empty, their windows boarded up or spider-webbed with cracks. The saloon still did business, and the general store hung on by sheer stubbornness, but the town felt like a dying thing, trying to convince itself it was still alive. Martha Webb's general store occupied the corner of Main and Trail Streets, a 2-story building with a false front that made it look grander than it was. Martha herself was a woman of 60-odd years, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been running the store since her husband died in a mine collapse 20 years back, and she knew every soul within 50 miles. The bell above the door chimed their arrival. Martha looked up from her ledger book, took one look at Hope, pressed. He close to Bond's side and understood immediately that questions would not be welcome. "Afternoon, Bond," she said calmly. "What can I help you with today?" "Need some clothes for the child," Bond replied, grateful for Martha's discretion. "Dresses, undergarments, shoes if you've got them in her size." Martha came around the counter, her movements careful and unthreatening. She knelt down to Hope's level, studying her with kind eyes. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Hope looked up at Bond, who nodded encouragement. "She's called Hope," he said. "She doesn't speak much." "That's all right," Martha said gently. "Sometimes words aren't necessary. May I measure you for clothes, Hope? I promise I'll be gentle." Hope considered this, then nodded slowly. Martha's hands were sure and practiced as she took measurements, and she kept up a gentle stream of chatter that seemed to calm the child. "You're staying with Bond, then? That's good. He's a fine man, though he's been too much alone these past years. I think you'll be good for each other." While Martha gathered clothing from her shelves, Hope wandered the store with wide eyes. She'd clearly come from money. Bond could tell by the way she examined the goods, comparing quality with the eye of someone who'd known better things. But there was wonder there too, as if she'd never been allowed to simply browse and explore. She stopped in front of a display of hair ribbons, her fingers hovering over a blue one that matched her eyes. Martha noticed and added it to the pile of clothes without comment. "This should do for now," Martha said, wrapping everything in brown paper. "Bring her back in a few weeks, and we'll see about winter coats." As Bond counted out coins from his dwindling savings, Martha leaned close and spoke quietly. "That deputy was in here yesterday, asking more questions about missing children. I told him nothing, of course, but he seemed awfully interested in anyone who might have taken in strays recently." Bond's jaw tightened. "Appreciate the warning. There's more. He mentioned a reward, substantial money for information. That kind of bounty brings out the worst in people, Bond. Be careful who you trust." They were loading their purchases into the wagon when the first sign of real trouble appeared. A man Bond didn't recognize sat on the saloon porch, watching them with cold eyes. He was well dressed for Dust Creek, with clean boots and a gun that looked like it had seen professional use. Hope spotted him too, and immediately pressed closer to Bond's side. Her whole body went rigid, and the wooden horse fell from nerveless fingers. "You know him?" Bond asked quietly. Hope shook her head, but he could feel her trembling. She might not know the man specifically, but she recognized the type, the kind of predator who hunted people for money. They drove home in tense silence, Hope's eyes constantly checking the trail behind them. Bond's hand stayed close to the rifle under the wagon seat, and his mind churned with possibilities. If bounty hunters were already sniffing around Dust Creek, it wouldn't be long before they widened their search. That evening, as Hope played quietly with her new clothes and the wooden horse, Bond sat on the porch and thought about the future. He'd been a soldier once, before Sarah, before Emma, before grief turned him into a hermit. He'd served in the Indian Wars, learned to track and hunt and fight when fighting was necessary. Those skills felt rusty now, 8 years unused, but they were still there. If Hope needed protecting, he'd remember how to be dangerous again. The sun was setting when Hope joined him on the porch, wearing one of her new dresses, a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes. She'd braided her clean hair with the ribbon Martha had given her, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked like what she was, a little girl instead of a victim. She sat beside him and pointed to the wooden horse in her lap. Then to him, her expression questioning. "You want to know about Emma?" he asked. Hope nodded. Bond was quiet for a long moment, gathering memories that still had sharp edges. "She was about your age when she died. Loved horses and stories and making up songs. She used to sit right here with me in the evenings, just like this." Hope reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently. Then she pointed to herself, and then to the wooden horse, her meaning clear. "You want to hear stories about Emma and her horse?" Another nod, this one eager. So Bond began to talk, slowly at first, then with growing ease. He told Hope about Emma's imaginary adventures, about the kingdoms she'd created, where wooden horses could fly, and little girls could defeat dragons with nothing but courage and kindness. He talked about Sarah's laughter and her terrible cooking and the way she hummed while she worked. Hope listened with rapt attention, occasionally smiling at the funny parts or squeezing his hand during the sad ones. And somewhere in the telling, Bon realized something had changed. For the first time in 8 years, he was sharing his memories instead of hoarding them like a miser counts coins. When full darkness fell, Hope yawned and leaned against his shoulder. She was tired, but fighting sleep, probably afraid of the nightmares that might come. "I'll be right here," Bon promised. "You're safe now." She looked up at him with those storm cloud eyes and for the first time tried to speak. Her lips moved carefully, forming a single word that came out as barely a whisper. "Papa." Bon's breath caught in his throat. He'd been many things in his life: soldier, husband, father, grieving widower, lonely hermit. But he'd never expected to be a father again. Never thought his broken heart could stretch wide enough to hold another child. "Yes," he whispered back. "I'll be your papa if you want me to be." Hope smiled and closed her eyes, finally ready for sleep. Bon carried her inside and tucked her into Emma's bed, the wooden horse cradled in her arms. Then he sat in the doorway, keeping watch. Until dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold. The bounty hunters were coming, and Deputy Mason was asking too many questions. And somewhere out there, powerful people were pulling strings to find one lost little girl. But for now, in this moment, Hope was safe and calling him Papa, and maybe that was miracle enough. The silver locket changed everything. Martha had insisted on giving Hope a proper bath, clucking over the girl like a mother hen, while Bon waited uncomfortably on the store's front porch. He could hear their voices, Martha's gentle questions and Hope's soft attempts at responses, drifting. Through the open window, it was Martha's sharp intake of breath that made him look up from his coffee. "Bon," she called, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to see this." He found them in the back room Martha used for storage and private matters. Hope sat wrapped in a towel, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders, while Martha held something small and glinting in the lamplight. "She had this hidden under her dress," Martha said quietly. "Sewn into the fabric so it wouldn't be found." The locket was exquisite, real silver, intricately engraved with roses and vines, the kind of jewelry that cost more than most people earned in a year. But it was what was inside that made Bon's blood run cold. 2 faces smiled up at him from the tiny photographs, a handsome man in an expensive suit and a beautiful woman with kind eyes and Hope's exact features. They looked like the sort of people who appeared in newspaper society pages, the kind who owned railroads and banks and senators. "Do you recognize them?" Martha asked, but Bon was already shaking his head. Hope, however, was watching them both with growing anxiety. She reached for the locket with trembling fingers, holding it against her chest like a shield. "These are your parents, aren't they?" Martha asked gently. Hope nodded, tears starting down her cheeks. "What happened to them, sweetheart?" The tears came harder now, and Hope began to shake her head frantically. She opened her mouth, trying desperately to speak, but only strangled sounds emerged. "Easy," Bon said, kneeling beside her. "You don't have to tell us now, but we need to know who they were, Hope. If we're going to keep you safe, we need to understand what we're up against." Martha disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a stack of old newspapers. She saved everything that came through the store, claiming you never knew when information might prove useful. "Rich people make the papers," she said, spreading the editions across her desk, "especially when something bad happens to them." It took less than 10 minutes to find the story that made everything clear. "Wealthy family murdered in home invasion." Read the headline from a Denver paper dated 3 months earlier. Below it, the same faces from the locket stared out from the page: Theodore and Margaret Kensington, along with their 2 children. Henry, age 15, and Catherine Elizabeth, age 12, had been found dead in their mansion outside Denver. The article described it as a robbery gone wrong, but the details were sparse and the investigation ongoing. Catherine Elizabeth, K.E. "Dear God," Martha whispered. "Hope, is this you? Are you Catherine Kensington?" Hope stared at the newspaper photo of herself, a formal portrait taken at what looked like a birthday party. showing a smiling girl in a white dress who bore only passing resemblance to the traumatized child sitting before them now. She nodded slowly, then shook her head, then nodded again. Yes, that was her face, her name, her family. But the girl in the picture was a stranger, someone who'd existed before the world turned into nightmare. But it says here that all the children were found dead, Bond said, reading further. How are you? Hope grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She pointed to the newspaper, then to herself, then made a slashing motion across her throat. Her meaning was clear. They'd tried to kill her too, but somehow she'd survived. You were there, Martha breathed. You saw what happened to your family. Hope's nod was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Bond felt his world tilt on its axis. This wasn't just some abused child fleeing a bad situation. This was the sole survivor of a massacre, a witness to murders that had been covered up and explained away. No wonder powerful people were hunting her. No wonder Deputy Mason had received that suspicious wire. We need to look at this more carefully, Martha said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. If Hope, Catherine, was supposed to be dead, then someone has a very good reason to want her to stay that way. They spent the next hour poring over every word of the articles Martha had saved. The official story painted the Kensingtons as victims of random violence, wealthy family targeted by desperate criminals who'd killed everyone and fled with the family's considerable cash reserves. But the more they read, the more the story fell apart. No arrests had been made, despite extensive investigations. The family's business partner, Richard Kensington, Theodore's younger brother, had inherited the entire estate and fortune. And most tellingly, Richard had been conveniently out of town on business when the murders occurred. Your uncle, Bond said, looking at Hope. Richard Kensington. He's the one who wants you dead, isn't he? Hope's face went white as fresh snow. She began to shake so violently that Martha wrapped her arms around the girl, murmuring comfort. You saw him do it, Martha said softly. You saw your uncle kill your family. The sound that came from Hope's throat was barely human, a keening wail of grief and terror that spoke of horrors no child should ever witness. She buried her face against Martha's shoulder and sobbed with the force of a breaking dam. How did you get away? Bond asked. When the worst of it had passed, Hope wiped her eyes and pointed to the locket, then made gestures that took several tries to understand. She'd hidden, Bond realized, somewhere in that big house. She'd found a place to hide while her family was murdered around her. And afterward, she'd taken only the locket, the one precious thing that proved who she was, and run 3 months, Martha said quietly. She's been running for 3 months, living like a wild animal, just trying to stay alive. The magnitude of what Hope had endured hit Bond like a physical blow. This child had watched her family die, fled into the wilderness with nothing, survived on scraps and willpower, and somehow made it hundreds of miles to his door. She was 12 years old and had more courage than most grown men would ever possess. We have to get her away from here, he said. If Richard Kensington has this many resources, if he can reach Deputy Mason, then nowhere in this territory is safe. But Hope was shaking her head frantically. She grabbed Bond's hands and pressed them against her face, her eyes pleading. You don't want to leave? He asked. She shook her head again, then pointed to him, then to herself, then to the cabin. Their cabin now, home. I understand, little one. But Pa, she whispered, the word coming easier now with practice. Then with tremendous effort she added another. Stay. Those 2 words, spoken in a voice like rustling leaves, carried the weight of desperation. Hope had found her place, her person, her safety. She would rather face whatever came than lose the only home she'd known since her world ended. Bond looked into those storm-cloud eyes and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Richard Kensington could send deputies and bounty hunters and anyone else he wanted. Let them come. Bond Ransom had failed to protect Sarah and Emma, but he would not fail Catherine Elizabeth Kensington, who had chosen to be Hope. We stay, he said firmly, but we get ready. If your uncle wants a fight, we'll give him one he won't forget, Martha nodded approvingly.
I'll help.
That bastard killed a family and let the world think it was robbery. Someone needs to pay for that. Hope smiled through her tears and spoke again, managing 3 whole words this time. Love you. Papa! The silver locket caught the lamplight as she fastened it around her neck, no longer hidden but worn openly. A declaration that Catherine Elizabeth Kensington had found her family after all. Not the one she'd been born to, but the one she'd chosen. The one worth fighting for. Outside Martha's store, the sun was setting over Dust Creek, painting everything gold and red. Somewhere out there, Richard Kensington's men were closing in, following a trail that would lead them straight to a grieving widower and a traumatized child. They had no idea what they were walking into. Bon Ransom had been a lot of things in his 52 years. Soldier, rancher, husband, father, broken man. Now he was about to become something new, a protector with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The war was coming to his doorstep whether he wanted it or not, but this time he was ready. The worn leather Bible had belonged to Bon's father, and his father before that. Its pages were soft with age and handling, marked with pressed flowers from Sarah's funeral and margin notes written in 3 generations of careful handwriting. Now it held something new, Hope's drawings, tucked between the pages like prayers made visible. She drew constantly now, using pencil stubs and scraps of paper Martha provided. The first pictures had been simple things, the wooden horse, the cabin, Bon's hands working at some task. But as her trust grew, so did the complexity of her art and the horror it revealed. "Show me again," Bon said gently, spreading the latest drawings across the kitchen table. "Help me understand what happened that night." Hope took a shaky breath and pointed to the first picture, a large house drawn in careful detail. Even rendered in pencil on brown wrapping paper, it looked grand and imposing. The kind of place where wealthy families lived their careful lives. The second drawing showed stick figures gathered around a dinner table. 4 people, happy and safe, sharing a meal. Hope had labeled each figure in careful block letters. Papa, Mama, Henry. The third drawing was where the nightmare began. Hope's small finger traced the lines she'd drawn. A man standing in the doorway, but this wasn't a family member. This figure held something in his hand, and the happy family at the table had changed. The stick figures were no longer upright and smiling. They were fallen, twisted. "Wrong, your Uncle Richard," Bon said, and Hope nodded. Tears already starting. She flipped to the 4th drawing, herself tiny and terrified, crammed into what looked like a cupboard or pantry, watching, seeing everything but powerless to help or even scream. "You hid in the kitchen pantry," Martha said softly. She'd come by that afternoon with supplies and stayed to help piece together the truth. Smart girl. He probably never thought to look there. The remaining drawings told the rest of the story in heartbreaking detail. The small figure fleeing the house in darkness, wandering through forests and across plains, growing thinner and more desperate with each page until the final picture, herself, collapsed behind a cabin, while a giant figure approached with outstretched hands. "That's when you found me," Hope whispered, her voice still fragile but growing stronger each day. "When I found you." Bon gathered the drawings carefully and placed them back in the Bible. Each one was evidence of Richard Kensington's crimes. But more than that, they were proof of Hope's incredible strength. She'd survived the unsurvivable and somehow found her way to safety. Martha had spent the morning at the telegraph office in the county seat, researching everything she could find about the Kensington family. What she'd discovered painted a picture of greed and long-simmering resentment. Richard Kensington was always the poor relation, she explained, consulting her notes. Theodore inherited the family business when their father died. Mining interests, railroad investments, cattle ranches spanning 3 territories. Richard got a small allowance and a job managing one of the smaller operations. Enough to make most men wealthy, Bon observed, but not enough for someone who felt entitled to everything his older brother had. The newspapers hint at bad blood between them, business disputes that went back years. Hope listened intently, absorbing information about the family dynamics she'd been too young to fully understand. Her drawings had captured the emotional truth. Uncle Richard had always frightened her, even before that terrible night. There had been something cold in his eyes, something hungry. With Theodore and his children dead, Richard inherits everything, Martha continued. But if Hope and Catherine is still alive, legally she has a stronger claim to her father's estate. So he needs her dead, not just to cover up his crimes, but to keep his stolen fortune, Bond concluded. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, too many horses for a friendly visit. Bond moved to the window and felt his blood run cold. 6 men rode up to his cabin, all well armed, and wearing the kind of clothes that meant they were professionals. Leading them was a man Bond recognized from town, the well-dressed stranger who'd been watching them outside the general store. Up close, he looked even more dangerous, with pale eyes that held no warmth and hands that rested easy on his gun. "That's Jim Crawford," Martha whispered. "He's been asking questions all over town, offering money for information about a missing girl." "Hope, get to Emma's room," Bond said quietly. "Hide in the closet like we practiced. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you." Hope's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded and slipped away silently. Bond waited until he heard the soft click of the bedroom door closing, then stepped out onto his porch. Crawford dismounted and approached with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating others. His 5 companions stayed on their horses, hands near their weapons. "Afternoon," Crawford said pleasantly. "Name's Jim Crawford. I'm looking for someone, and I have reason to believe you might be able to help me." "Don't know what kind of help I could be," Bond replied. "I keep to myself out here." "See, that's interesting because I've been hearing different stories." Crawford pulled out a photograph, one of those formal portraits rich families commissioned. It showed Hope as she'd been before the nightmare began, dressed in expensive clothes and smiling at the camera. "This girl has been missing for several months. Her family is very worried about her. Her family's dead," Martha said flatly, stepping up beside Bond. "I read the newspapers. Whole family murdered in Denver." Crawford's smile never wavered. "There seems to be some confusion about that. See, this girl's uncle, her legal guardian now, hired me to bring her home safely. He's quite concerned about her welfare." "I'm sure he is," Bond said dryly. "Now, I'm a reasonable man," Crawford continued, "and I understand that folks out here might be naturally protective of a lost child. So I'm authorized to offer a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. $500 cash money. $500 was more than most people in Dust Creek would see in 2 years. It was enough to buy silence, cooperation, and betrayal from almost anyone. Crawford knew exactly what he was doing. "Haven't seen any lost children," Bond said firmly. "And even if I had, I wouldn't hand a little girl over to a man who rides with 5 armed men." Crawford's pleasant expression finally cracked, showing something cold underneath. "See, that's where you're wrong, Mr. Ransom, because I've already spoken to Deputy Mason, and he's given me full authority to search any property where this girl might be hiding." "Deputy Mason has no jurisdiction over federal crimes," Martha said sharply. "And kidnapping crosses territorial lines, which makes it a federal matter." "Smart woman," Crawford acknowledged. "But see, we're not kidnapping anyone. We're returning a lost child to her legal guardian. Perfectly legitimate." One of Crawford's men shifted in his saddle, and Bond caught a glimpse of a badge pinned inside the man's coat. These weren't just bounty hunters. They were operating with some kind of official sanction, real or forged. "I'll ask you one more time," Crawford said, his voice hardening. "Is the girl here?" "No," Bond lied smoothly. "And now you're trespassing on my property. I suggest you move along." Crawford studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his men. They began to spread out, surrounding the cabin with practiced ease. "Thing is, Mr. Ransom, I don't believe you. My associate over there has been watching your place for 2 days now. He saw you and an older woman bring a young girl back from town yesterday. Girl with dark hair about the right age." Bond's heart sank. They'd been more careful than he'd realized, but not careful enough. "Crawford had them dead to rights, so here's what's going to happen," Crawford continued. "My men are going to search your property, and we're going to find that girl. Now you can cooperate and collect your reward money, or you can make this difficult and regret it later." Martha stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. You have no legal right to search this property without a warrant signed by a federal judge. And I doubt very much that Richard Kensington's money can reach that high. The mention of Richard's name made Crawford's eyes narrow dangerously. How do you know that name? Because I can read, Martha snapped. And I know a murderer's hired gun when I see one. For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Crawford's hand drifted toward his gun, and Bond tensed, ready to throw himself in front of Martha if necessary. Then Crawford smiled again. But this time, it was like watching a snake bare its fangs. Search the property, he ordered his men. Tear it apart if you have to. The girl is here somewhere. As the men dismounted and began advancing on the cabin, Bond made a decision that would either save Hope's life or end his own. He stepped back inside, moving casually toward the corner where his father's old service revolver waited, cleaned and loaded for the first time in years. Behind him, he heard Martha talking loudly, probably trying to warn Hope to stay hidden. The sound of boots on his porch told him Crawford's men were already inside. Time was up. The pretending was over. Now came the part where Bond Ransom remembered how to fight. From Emma's room came the faint sound of the music box playing. Amazing Grace, Hope's signal that she was hidden and ready. The melody drifted through the cabin like a prayer, steady and sure despite the approaching storm. Bond wrapped his fingers around the revolver's familiar grip and said a prayer of his own, not for victory, because he was outnumbered 6-1, but for enough time to get Hope to safety, whatever happened next. Richard Kensington's hired killers were about to learn that some men were worth more than their bounties, and some children were worth dying for. The military service revolver felt strange in Bond's hands after so many years of peace. His father had carried it through 2 wars and countless skirmishes, and the weight of that history seemed to settle into Bond's bones as he checked the cylinder one final time. 6 bullets. 6 men outside. The mathematics of violence were simple and unforgiving. Crawford's men were already moving through his home, their boots heavy on the wooden floors Sarah had swept every morning for 15 years. Bond heard them overturning furniture, opening drawers, treating his life's memories like obstacles to be cleared away. "Easy, boys," Crawford called from the porch. "We're looking for a little girl, not buried treasure. Try not to break everything." From Emma's room came the steady melody of the music box. Amazing Grace played on tiny metal tines, each note a promise that Hope was still safe, still hidden. Bond clung to that sound like a lifeline as he moved to the kitchen window. Martha stood in the yard, her arms crossed and her face set in lines of righteous anger. She was talking loudly, probably still trying to buy time, but Crawford wasn't paying attention to her anymore. His pale eyes were fixed on the cabin, watching his men work with the patience of a professional predator. "Found something," one of the searchers called out. He emerged from Emma's room holding the wooden horse, the one Bond had carved with clumsy fingers during that long winter when his daughter fought pneumonia. Crawford examined it with interest. "Child's toy. Recent handling, I'd say." He looked up at Martha. "Still want to tell me there's no little girl here?" "That belonged to Bond's daughter," Martha said firmly. "She died years ago. Maybe, or maybe someone's been playing with it recently." Crawford tossed the horse aside like trash. "Keep looking, boys. She's here somewhere." The casual dismissal of Emma's treasure sent rage flooding through Bond's chest. That horse had been his daughter's most precious possession, had comforted her through fever dreams and lonely nights. Now it lay in the dust like refuse, discarded by men who wouldn't understand love if it bit them. The music box continued to play, but Bond could hear the slight variations that told him Hope was winding it manually. She was staying calm, following their plan, trusting him to protect her. That trust was both a blessing and a burden, heavier than any weight he'd ever carried. Another searcher emerged from the cabin. "Nothing in the main rooms, boss. But there's something odd about the girl's bedroom. Bed's been slept in recently, and there are fresh clothes in the dresser." Crawford's smile was sharp as a blade. "Is that so? Well. Seems our Mr. Ransom has been less than truthful." Bond stepped onto the porch, the revolver hanging loose at his side. "Those clothes belong to my daughter. I've never had the heart to pack them away." Touching, Crawford said without an ounce of sympathy. "But my man knows the difference between old clothes and new ones. Those dresses were bought recently, sized for a 12-year-old girl. The pretense was crumbling faster than Bon had hoped. He'd known this moment would come, but he'd prayed for more time to prepare, more options than the bloody ones now spreading before him. "Let's say you're right," Bon said carefully. "Let's say there is a child here. What makes you think I'd hand her over to men who ride armed and threaten violence against innocent folks?" Crawford's laugh was like ice cracking. "Because the alternative is so much worse, Mr. Ransom. You see, I've been doing this for a long time. I know how to make people cooperate one way or another." He gestured to his men, who began forming a loose circle around the cabin. Each one carried multiple weapons and moved with the easy confidence of professional killers. "You're outnumbered 6-1, Crawford continued. "You've got an old woman to worry about and a little girl to protect. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone, but that's entirely up to you." The music box fell silent. In that sudden quiet, Bon heard the soft creak of floorboards that told him hope was moving inside the cabin. She was probably terrified, listening to voices that promised violence and death. But she was following their plan, staying hidden until he could figure a way out of this mess. $500, Crawford said, pulling a thick roll of bills from his coat. "More money than you'll see in 2 years of scratching at this worthless dirt. All you have to do is step aside and let us collect what we came for." Martha spat in the dust at Crawford's feet. "The child's not cargo to be collected. She's a human being who's already suffered enough. The child is property of her legal guardian," Crawford corrected. "And that guardian wants her home. End of discussion. Her guardian murdered her family," Bond said quietly. The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Crawford's pleasant mask finally slipped completely, revealing the killer underneath. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Ransom. You got proof of that?" "I've got the word of a child who saw it happen." Crawford nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Well then, that does change things. Can't have witnesses spreading lies about respectable citizens, can we?" The threat was naked now, all pretense abandoned. These men weren't here to rescue a lost child. They were here to silence the only person who could testify against Richard Kensington. Hope's value wasn't as a niece to be protected, but as a loose end to be tied off permanently. "Here's my final offer," Crawford said, his hand resting on his gun butt. "You give us the girl now, and we'll make sure your death looks like an accident. Refuse, and we'll take our time with both of you. Your choice." Bon looked at Martha, standing defiant in the face of certain death. He thought of Hope, hiding in Emma's closet, trusting him to keep her safe. He remembered Sarah's laugh and Emma's songs, and all the quiet moments of love that made life worth living. Then he thought of Richard Kensington, sitting comfortable in his stolen mansion, counting money paid for with his brother's blood. The revolver felt steady in his hand as he raised it. "I've got a counter-offer," he said calmly. "You and your men get back on your horses and ride out of here. Do that, and maybe you live to see another sunset." Crawford's eyes widened with what might have been genuine surprise. "You're serious? An old man with an antique pistol against 6 professionals, and you're making threats, not threats, promises." For a moment, Crawford actually seemed to consider the possibility that Bond might be dangerous. Then he shook his head and laughed. "Boys, seems we've got ourselves a genuine frontier hero here. One of those stubborn old-timers who thinks courage can stop bullets." He drew his own weapon with practiced speed. "Let's teach him different." The first shot came from one of Crawford's men, positioned near the barn. The bullet splintered wood from the porch post inches from Bond's head, but he was already moving, diving behind the water trough as return fire erupted from multiple directions. Martha scrambled for cover behind the wagon, pulling out a shotgun that Bond hadn't known she carried. The first blast took down the man by the barn, spinning him around in a spray of blood and surprise. "Didn't expect that, did you?" she shouted over the gunfire. From inside the cabin came a new sound, not the music box this time, but Hope's voice, clear and strong despite the chaos. "Papa! Papa, I'm safe." The sound of her voice, calling him by the name she'd chosen for him, filled Bon with a fierce joy that burned away fear and doubt. Whatever happened next, Hope knew she was loved. She knew someone was fighting for her. That was enough. Bon rose from behind the trough and began to return fire, each shot carefully aimed. Each bullet a promise kept to a little girl who'd already lost too much. Crawford's men were good, professional killers who knew their trade. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd threatened his daughter, and some mistakes. Bon Ransom reflected as he sent another of Crawford's men tumbling into the dust. Were too expensive to survive. The war had come to his doorstep, just as he'd known it would. Now came the part where he won it. The gunfight lasted 7 minutes and changed everything. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Crawford's men lay dead in Bon's yard, and Crawford himself nursed a shattered shoulder while his remaining companions retreated to defensive positions behind the barn. Martha had taken a graze across her arm, but was still fighting, her shotgun speaking with deadly authority whenever one of the killers showed himself. But it was what happened next that turned Bon's understanding of the world upside down. Enough, Crawford shouted, his voice tight with pain and rage. I've got something you need to hear before this goes any further. Bon kept his revolver trained on the barn, but he held his fire. Something in Crawford's tone suggested this wasn't just another attempt at negotiation. The girl isn't who you think she is, Crawford called out. Catherine Kensington died with her family 3 months ago, just like the newspapers said. Liar, Martha spat, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Check her belongings again, Crawford continued. Really check them. That child you're protecting isn't Theodore Kensington's daughter. She's the bastard child of his older brother Marcus, who died 20 years ago. Hope's voice came from inside the cabin, thin and frightened. Papa, what's he talking about? Bon felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, but he kept his weapon steady. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. She's still just a child who needs protecting. Crawford's laugh was bitter. You don't understand. If she's Marcus Kensington's daughter, then she has a stronger claim to the family fortune than anyone. Theodore only inherited because Marcus died without legitimate heirs. But a bastard child, legally acknowledged or not, changes everything. Through the broken cabin window, Bon could see Hope standing in the doorway of Emma's room, clutching something in her hands. Even at a distance, he could tell she was holding the hidden marriage certificate, the one she'd kept secret even from him. Show him the papers, Crawford demanded, somehow knowing what Hope carried. Show him what you've been hiding, girl. Hope's small voice was barely audible over the distance. I was scared you wouldn't want me if you knew. Martha lowered her shotgun, staring at the cabin with dawning understanding. Hope, what papers is he talking about? With trembling hands, Hope emerged onto the porch, carrying a folded document that looked official and legal. Her storm-cloud eyes were bright with unshed tears as she handed it to Bon. The marriage certificate was dated 21 years. Earlier, a legal union between Marcus Kensington and a woman named Elizabeth Hartwell, and at the bottom, in faded ink, was a notation about a daughter born to the union. Catherine Elizabeth Kensington, legitimate heir to the Marcus Kensington estate. Dear God, Martha breathed, reading over Bon's shoulder. She's not Theodore's daughter at all. That's right, Crawford called out, his voice gaining strength. Marcus was the elder brother, the rightful heir to everything. When he died, Theodore inherited, but only because everyone believed Marcus had no children. This little girl is the true Kensington heir. Hope was crying now, quiet tears that spoke of shame and fear. I found the papers in Papa, in Theodore's safe, the night Uncle Richard came. They were hidden behind other documents. I took them when I ran, because I thought they might be important. Bon's mind raced through the implications. If Hope was Marcus's legitimate daughter, then Theodore had never been the rightful heir. He'd built his fortune on a lie, and Richard had killed him for an inheritance that wasn't even legally his to claim. But why would Theodore raise her as his own daughter if she wasn't? Martha asked. Hope's whispered answer broke Bon's heart. Because his own daughter died when she was little. Elizabeth, my real mama, died giving birth to me, and Marcus died in a mining accident when I was 2. Theodore and Margaret took me in and loved me like their own. They never told anyone the truth about who I really was. They were protecting her, Bon realized. If people knew she was Marcus's heir, there would have been legal challenges, threats, people trying to use her. Crawford's voice carried a note of grudging respect. Theodore was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He kept the girl close, treated her like family, and made sure the real inheritance documents stayed hidden. Probably planned to reveal the truth when she came of age. But Richard found out, Martha said quietly. Richard always suspected, Crawford confirmed. He spent years searching for proof that Marcus had fathered a child. When he finally found evidence, he realized that killing Theodore wasn't enough. The girl had to die too, or his claim to the fortune would never be secure. Hope looked up at Bon with eyes full of terror and confusion. Does this change things? Do you still want me? The question hit Bon like a physical blow. This child, this brave, broken little girl who'd called him Papa and brought light back into his dark world, was afraid he might abandon her because of legal documents and inheritance laws. Hope, he said, kneeling down to her level. I don't care if you're the richest person in 3 territories or if you don't have a penny to your name. You're my daughter now, and that's not changing. But even as he spoke the words, Bon understood that everything else was about to change. Hope wasn't just a witness to her family's murder. She was the key to one of the largest fortunes in the American West. Men would kill for much less, and Richard Kensington had already proven how far he was willing to go. This complicates things, Martha said grimly. Complicates them how? Crawford called out, apparently still listening to every word. Bon stood slowly, his mind working through possibilities. Because now we know why you really came here. You're not just cleaning up loose ends for Richard. You're after the inheritance documents that would prove Hope's claim. Crawford's silence was answer enough. Without those papers, Bon continued, Richard's claim stands. But with them, Hope becomes one of the wealthiest people in the territory. That's quite a bounty you're hunting, Crawford. When Crawford finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Ransom. Yes, Richard wants the girl dead. But certain other parties would pay handsomely to see those documents delivered intact, along with the rightful heir. Other parties? Martha demanded. Theodore had business partners, investors, creditors. Lot of people stand to gain if the true heir comes forward. Lot of people who might be willing to pay more than Richard Kensington for the girl's protection. Hope clutched the marriage certificate to her chest, understanding dawning in her storm-cloud eyes. I'm not just running from Uncle Richard anymore, am I? No, sweetheart, Bon said heavily. Now you're running from everyone who wants to use you for your money. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of horses approaching from the distance. Too many horses, moving too fast. Crawford's men began shouting warnings to each other, and even from behind the barn, one could hear the panic in their voices. That's not Richard's people, Crawford called out, his voice tight with sudden fear. Those are federal marshals, Martha grabbed Hope's hand.
How do you know?
Because I just figured out who's been playing us all for fools, Crawford replied, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he sounded genuinely afraid. Richard Kensington isn't the only one who wants this girl found. The approaching riders were close enough now that Bon could see their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Federal marshals, just as Crawford had said, riding hard and looking like men on official business. Hope pressed closer to Bon's side, her small hand finding his. Papa, I'm scared. I know, little one, he said, watching the marshals approach. But whatever happens next, we'll face it together. The marriage certificate crackled in Hope's other hand, proof of her true identity and rightful inheritance, but also the document that had painted a target on her back. She was no longer just Catherine Elizabeth Kensington, survivor of a family massacre. She was the true Kensington heir, worth more money than most people could imagine. And suddenly everyone wanted a piece of that fortune. The war for Hope's life was about to get much more complicated. The federal marshals arrived like a storm front, 6 hard men wearing badges and carrying the authority of the territorial government. Their leader was a grizzled veteran named Tom Bradley, who dismounted with the careful movements of someone who'd survived too many gunfights to be careless now. "Jim Crawford," Bradley called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "You and your men, throw down your weapons and come out with your hands visible." Crawford's bitter laugh echoed from behind the barn. "Well, well, Marshal Bradley should have known Washington would send their best bloodhound. Federal warrant for your arrest, Jim. Multiple counts of murder, kidnapping and conspiracy. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Bond kept Hope close behind him, the marriage certificate tucked safely in his shirt pocket. Martha stood to his other side, her shotgun reloaded but lowered in deference to federal authority. "Marshal Bradley," Bond called out. "I'm Bon Ransom. This is my property. Mind telling me what's going on here?" Bradley's eyes took in the dead men in the yard, the bullet holes in the cabin, and the defensive positions everyone had taken. "Got a report about armed men threatening civilians. Looks like we arrived just in time." "Report from who?" Crawford demanded from his hiding spot. Bradley smiled grimly. "Richard Kensington himself. Seems he got worried when his hired guns stopped reporting in. Thought maybe you'd decided to go into business for yourself, Jim." The implications hit Bond like a physical blow. Richard Kensington had played everyone perfectly, hiring Crawford to eliminate Hope, then reporting him to federal authorities when the job took too long. If Crawford succeeded, Richard would claim ignorance and let the marshals clean up the mess. If Crawford failed, Richard could play the concerned guardian trying to rescue his kidnapped niece. "He set us all up," Martha breathed. "That's Richard's specialty," Bradley confirmed. "We've been building a case against him for months. Murder, fraud, conspiracy. The man's got more crimes than a dime novel villain." Hope stepped forward, her small hand clutching Bond's shirt sleeve. "Marshal, are you here to take me back to Uncle Richard?" Bradley's weathered face softened as he looked down at her. "No, sweetheart. We're here to make sure you're safe. Richard Kensington is going to prison for what he did to your family. But I'm not his family," Hope said quietly. "Not really." Bradley's eyebrows rose. "What do you mean by that?" Bond pulled the marriage certificate from his pocket and handed it over. "The child isn't Theodore Kensington's daughter. She's Marcus Kensington's legitimate heir." The marshal studied the document with growing amazement. "Marcus Kensington, the elder brother who died 20 years ago." "The same." "Which makes her the true heir to the entire Kensington fortune." Bradley whistled low. No wonder Richard wanted her dead. With this document, she could claim everything he's inherited. From behind the barn, Crawford's voice was desperate now. "Bradley, you know me. I was just following orders." "Orders to murder a child," Bradley called back. "That's not the Jim Crawford I used to know." "The money changed him," one of Crawford's surviving men shouted. "Changed all of us. Richard promised us more gold than we'd see in 10 lifetimes if we brought the girl back dead." "Shut up, Hawkins!" Crawford snarled, but it was too late. Hawkins had decided to save his own skin. "We got proof, Marshal. Crawford's got Richard's letters, promising payment for the girl's death. We was supposed to make it look like an accident, but when this old rancher started fighting back, I said, 'Shut up.'" The sound of Crawford's gun firing was followed immediately by Hawkins' scream. The surviving gunman had just learned the price of betrayal. "That's murder, Jim," Bradley said calmly. "Added to all the other charges, you're looking at a rope." Hope tugged on Bond's shirt. "Papa, what happens to me now? If Uncle Richard goes to prison, who takes care of me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the recent gunfight. Hope was worth millions, but she was also an orphan 12-year-old girl who'd spent 3 months running for her life. The law would have to sort out her guardianship, her inheritance, her entire future. "That's up to the territorial court," Bradley said gently. "But in the meantime, you're safe here with Mr. Ransom, if that's what you want." "It's what I want," Hope said firmly, then looked up at Bond with those storm cloud eyes. "If Papa wants me to stay," Bond's throat tightened with emotion. After everything they'd been through, after all the revelations about her true identity and inheritance, she was still afraid he might not want her forever. He said simply, "You're my daughter, Hope, rich or poor, Kensington or not. You're mine and I'm yours." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Well, that's settled then. Now what about those remaining killers behind my barn? Bradley signaled his men to spread out. Jim Crawford, I'm giving you one last chance. Come out peacefully and we'll see you get a fair trial. Fair trial? Crawford's laugh was edged with hysteria. You think Richard Kensington's going to let me live long enough for a trial? He's got judges and politicians in his pocket across 3 territories. The moment I surrender, I'm a dead man. Then you should have thought of that before you took his money, Bradley replied, the standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Crawford and his remaining man were trapped behind the barn with nowhere to run. Bradley's marshals had them surrounded, and federal warrants carried more weight than local corruption. But Bond could see the desperation in Crawford's position, and desperate men made dangerous choices. Marshal, he said quietly, Crawford's got nothing left to lose now. He might decide to take some of us with him. I know, Bradley murmured back. Keep the girl inside until this is finished. Hope shook her head stubbornly. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of running. I want to see the end of this. Before Bond could stop her, she walked out into the yard, still small and fragile-looking, but carrying herself with new dignity. The marriage certificate might have proven her legal identity, but this moment proved something more important. Hope had found her courage. Mr. Crawford, she called out, her young voice carrying clearly across the yard. You can come out now? I'm not afraid of you anymore. The silence that followed was profound. Then Crawford emerged from behind the barn, his wounded shoulder making his movements awkward, but his gun still steady in his good hand. His eyes were wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. You should be afraid, little girl, he said. You should be very afraid. Because of you, I'm going to hang. Because of Uncle Richard, Hope corrected gently. You were just his weapon. But weapons can choose not to fire. Crawford stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You're not what I expected. I'm exactly what you'd expect from Theodore and Margaret's daughter, Hope replied. They taught me that everyone deserves a chance to do the right thing. Even you. From Emma's room came the familiar melody of the music box playing Amazing Grace. The wind must have started it somehow, or perhaps it was simply time for its daily song. The gentle music drifted across the tense yard like a prayer made audible. Hope smiled at the sound. That was my sister Emma's music box. She died before I came to live here, but Papa says she would have liked me. I think she would have liked you too if you'd given her the chance. Crawford's gun hand was trembling now, and tears ran down his weathered cheeks. I've done terrible things, child. Things that can't be undone. I know, Hope said softly. But you can still choose how your story ends. The music box played on, its simple melody speaking of grace and redemption and second chances. Crawford stood frozen in that moment, balanced between the man he'd been and the man he might still become. Finally, slowly, he let his gun fall to the dust. I surrender, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. God help me, I surrender. As Bradley's men moved in to arrest Crawford and his surviving companion, Bon wrapped his arms around Hope and held her close. The immediate danger was over, but he knew their troubles were just beginning. Richard Kensington still had to be brought to justice. Hope's inheritance would have to be sorted out through the courts. Legal guardianship would need to be established. And somewhere out there, other people who wanted to use a wealthy orphan for their own purposes were probably already making plans. But for now, in this moment, with the music box playing Emma's favorite hymn and Hope safe in his arms, Bon allowed himself to hope that the worst was behind them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they would sleep peacefully in their own beds, in their own home, as a real family at last. The music box wound down slowly, its final notes fading into the evening air like a blessing on all who heard them. 3 days after Crawford's surrender, Richard Kensington came calling himself. He arrived at dawn with a dozen armed men and a federal judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The procession kicked up clouds of dust as they approached Bond's cabin, their horses moving with the measured pace of men who believed themselves untouchable. Hope spotted them first from the kitchen window, where she'd been helping Bond prepare breakfast. Her face went white as desert bone, but she didn't run or hide. 3 months of terror had taught her that running only delayed the inevitable. "Papa," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "When he's here," Bond set down his coffee cup, Sarah's cup, the one Hope had learned to drink from, and reached for his gun belt. The federal marshals had remained in Dust Creek, working on their case against Richard, but they'd promised to come, if called. Whether they'd arrive in time was another question entirely. "Remember what we talked about," Bond said, checking his father's revolver one more time. "If things go bad, you run to Martha's. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just run. I'm not leaving you," Hope replied with quiet determination. "You are if I tell you to." "That's an order from your papa," she nodded reluctantly, but Bond could see the stubborn set to her jaw that meant she'd make her own choices when the time came. It was a look he'd seen in Sarah's eyes countless times, the expression of a woman who would fight for her family, no matter the cost. Richard Kensington dismounted, in Bond's yard like a king surveying his domain. He was a handsome man in his 40s, well-dressed and well-fed, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from a lifetime of getting his own way. But there was something cold in his eyes, something reptilian that made Bond's skin crawl. "Mr. Ransom," Richard called out pleasantly, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Bond stepped onto the porch, Hope close behind him despite his wishes. "I don't have anything that belongs to you, Mr. Kensington." My dear niece would disagree. Richard's smile was sharp as a blade. "Catherine, sweetheart, come give your uncle a hug." "I've been so worried about you." Hope pressed closer to Bond's side but didn't retreat. "I'm not Catherine anymore. My name is Hope." "Nonsense, child. You're Catherine Elizabeth Kensington, daughter of my beloved late brother Theodore. And as your legal guardian, I'm here to take you home." The federal judge, a nervous man named Morrison, who kept mopping his brow with a handkerchief, stepped forward with visible reluctance. "I have the proper custody orders," he said, his voice barely audible. Bond studied the papers Morrison handed him, but the legal language might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. What he could understand was that these documents gave Richard complete authority over Hope's life, a property and future. "These papers aren't worth the ink they're written on," Bond said, handing them back. "Hope isn't Theodore's daughter, and you know it." Richard's pleasant expression never wavered. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." Hope stepped forward, pulling the marriage certificate from her dress pocket. "This proves who I really am. I'm Marcus Kensington's daughter, not Theodore's. That makes me the rightful heir to everything you've stolen." For just a moment, Richard's mask slipped, revealing the cold fury underneath. Then he laughed, the sound like winter wind through dead leaves. "My dear child, do you really think anyone will believe the word of a traumatized little girl over documented legal proceedings? Theodore Kensington raised you as his daughter, legally adopted you, made you his heir. These fantasies about Marcus are just the confused memories of someone who's been through terrible trauma. The marriage certificate is real," Bond said firmly. "Documents can be forged," Richard replied smoothly. "Desperate people do desperate things when they're trying to steal a fortune that doesn't belong to them." Judge Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Ransom, while I sympathize with your situation, the law is quite clear. Mr. Kensington has legal custody of the child, and I'm bound by federal statute to enforce that custody, even if he murdered her family." Hope asked, her young voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. Every one of Richard's men shifted nervously at the accusation. Morrison went pale, but Richard just smiled wider. "You see, Judge Morrison, this poor child has been completely poisoned against her own family. It's tragic what isolation and fear can do to a developing mind." "I saw you do it," Hope said, stepping forward despite Bond's restraining hand. "I saw you kill Papa Theodore and Mama Margaret and my brother Henry. I was hiding in the kitchen pantry, and I watched you murder my family." Richard's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Catherine, sweetheart, you weren't even in the house that night. The authorities found you 3 miles away, wandering in shock. You couldn't possibly have seen anything, because you thought I was dead." Hope's voice was growing stronger, more confident. "You shot at me when I tried to run, but I got away. That's why there's a bullet hole in the kitchen wall behind the pantry." For the first time, Richard looked genuinely surprised. He recovered quickly, but not before several of his men exchanged glances. Even if that were true, which it isn't, the word of a child against a respected businessman means nothing in court. Especially the word of a child who stands to inherit millions, if her delusions are believed. Bond's hand drifted to his gun as he read the situation. Richard had come prepared for legal challenges, not gunfights. His men were hired muscle, not experienced killers like Crawford's crew. But they were still a dozen armed men against one aging rancher and a 12-year-old girl. "Judge Morrison," Bond said carefully, "I'm requesting federal protection for this child under the witness protection statutes. She's the key witness in a murder case." Morrison mopped his brow again. "I'm afraid that's outside my jurisdiction, Mr. Ransom. Family court matters take precedence over criminal proceedings unless there's immediate danger." "There is immediate danger," Hope said quietly. "Uncle Richard is going to kill me, just like he killed the rest of my family." Richard's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "Kill you? My dear child, you're worth far more to me alive than dead. You're my meal ticket, my golden goose. Why would I harm the source of my fortune?" The casual admission hung in the air like smoke. Richard had just confirmed that he was using Hope for her inheritance, treating her like property rather than family. "That's not what Crawford said," Bond observed. "According to him, you wanted the girl dead to secure your claim to the fortune." "Crawford was a liar and a killer," Richard replied smoothly. "He was trying to save his own skin by implicating innocent people in his crimes." But Hope was shaking her head. "No, Papa's right. Uncle Richard needs me dead because I'm not Theodore's daughter. If people find out I'm really Marcus's heir, they'll want to see proof. And the only proof is the marriage certificate and me. He can destroy the paper, but as long as I'm alive to tell the truth." She let the implication hang unfinished, but everyone in the yard understood. Hope was living evidence of Richard's fraudulent claim to the Kensington fortune. Richard's pleasant mask was slipping again, revealing glimpses of the monster underneath. "Catherine, you're being very foolish. Come with me now, and we can forget all these wild accusations. Continue down this path, and I can't guarantee your safety or the safety of your adoptive father." The threat was naked now, all pretense abandoned. Bond's hand closed on his gun grip, metal worn smooth by his father's fingers. "Hope," he said quietly, "go inside." "No, Papa. We face this together. This isn't your fight." "Child?" "Yes, it is," Hope said, and her voice carried an authority that surprised everyone. "This is exactly my fight. Uncle Richard killed my family for money, and now he wants to kill me for the same reason. But I'm not running anymore." She walked to the center of the yard, a small figure dwarfed by the men and horses surrounding her. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she held herself, that made her seem larger than her 12 years. Around Bond's neck, hidden beneath his shirt, hung his old military dog tags, 2 pieces of metal that had seen him through battles and campaigns, through love and loss. Now they would see him through one more fight, perhaps his last, because as he watched Hope face down the man who'd destroyed her world, Bond Ransom made a decision that would define the rest of his life. However long or short it might be, Richard Kensington wanted a fight. Then he'd get one. But first he'd learn what it meant to threaten a father's daughter. The bullet that was meant for Hope struck Bond's military dog tags instead. The shot had come without warning, Richard's patience finally exhausted, his pleasant mask discarded like a worn-out costume. He'd drawn his silver-plated derringer with practiced speed, aiming directly at Hope's heart as she stood defiant in the center of the yard. But Bond had read the killer's intent in Richard's eyes and thrown himself forward just as the gun fired. The bullet struck the dog tags with a sharp ping, the impact spinning him around and knocking him to his knees. But the metal had deflected the shot enough to save his life. "Papa!" Hope's scream cut through the morning air like a blade. Chaos erupted in the yard. Judge Morrison dove behind the wagon, shouting about federal crimes and jurisdiction. Richard's hired men reached for their weapons, confused by their employer's sudden violence. and Martha Webb appeared from around the cabin's corner with her shotgun, flanked by 6 riders, wearing federal marshal badges. "Drop your weapons," Marshal Bradley shouted, his men spreading out to surround Richard's group. "You're all under arrest for attempted murder of a federal witness." But Richard wasn't finished. His derringer held 2 shots, and Hope was still standing exposed in the center of the yard. "You can't have her," Richard snarled, raising the gun again. "She's mine. The fortune is mine." This time, Hope didn't wait for someone else to protect her. As Richard's finger tightened on the trigger, Hope opened her mouth and spoke with a voice that had found its strength at last. "Help! Someone help us! He's trying to kill us!" Her words rang out clear and strong, reaching not just the marshals and Richard's men, but the dozen townspeople who'd followed the federal officers from Dust Creek, men and women who'd watched Hope grow from a terrified mute child into a brave young girl who'd earned their respect and protection. The sound of her voice, fully returned, no longer silenced by trauma, seemed to break some spell that had held everyone frozen. Richard's men began throwing down their weapons rather than face federal charges. Judge Morrison was babbling about being coerced and threatened. And from the town came more riders, more witnesses to Richard Kensington's final moments of freedom. But Richard himself seemed beyond caring about consequences. His eyes were wild with the desperation of a man watching his carefully built empire crumble. "She's lying," he screamed, waving the derringer wildly. "They're all lying. I'm the rightful heir. I'm the one who deserves the fortune." "The only thing you deserve is a rope," Martha said grimly, her shotgun trained on Richard's chest. Marshal Bradley moved closer, his own weapon drawn but not yet aimed. "Mr. Kensington, put down the gun." "It's over. We have Crawford's testimony, the murder weapon from the original killings, and now attempted murder of a child in front of federal officers." "You're finished. It's not over until she's dead," Richard snapped, turning the derringer back toward Hope. That's when Hope did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She began to recite, her young voice clear and steady, the words of testimony she'd been too terrified to speak for 3 months. "On the night of March 15th, I was hiding in the kitchen pantry when my Uncle Richard came to our house. He talked to Papa Theodore about business, about debts and partnerships. Then he pulled out a gun and shot Papa in the chest. When Mama Margaret screamed, he shot her too. My brother Henry tried to run, but Uncle Richard caught him by the stairs and, 'Shut up!' Richard roared. But Hope continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. He searched the house looking for me, calling my name, saying he was sorry and that it would be quick. But I stayed hidden until he left. Then I took the marriage certificate from Papa Theodore's safe and ran into the woods. I've been running ever since, but I'm not running anymore." The absolute silence that followed Hope's testimony was broken only by the sound of Richard Kensington weeping, not from remorse, but from the frustration of a man who'd lost everything he'd killed for. "She's lying," he whispered. But the words carried no conviction now. "No," Judge Morrison said quietly, emerging from behind the wagon with his legal dignity somewhat restored. "She's telling the truth, and I hereby revoke all custody orders and place Catherine Elizabeth Kensington, Hope Ransom, under the protection of the Territorial Court." Hope looked at the judge with surprise. "Ransom? Is that really my name now?" "If that's what you want it to be," Morrison replied gently. "Legal adoption can be arranged quite easily, especially given the circumstances." Bon struggled to his feet, his chest aching from the bullet's impact, but his heart soaring with pride. Hope had found her voice at the crucial moment, not just to speak, but to testify, to stand up for herself and demand justice. "Hope Ransom," she said, testing the name. "I like that." "I like that very much." Richard's derringer clattered to the ground as Marshal Bradley placed shackles on his wrists. The man who'd killed an entire family for money, who'd hired assassins to hunt down a 12-year-old girl, looked suddenly small and pathetic in the morning sun. "It should have been mine," he mumbled, as the marshals led him away. "Marcus was weak, Theodore was a fool, and that child was never supposed to survive. But I did survive. Hope said quietly, watching her uncle's arrest with steady eyes. "And now everyone will know what you did." As the dust settled and Richard's remaining men were processed for arrest, Martha noticed something that made her smile. Hope was standing close to Bon, not because she was afraid, but because that's where she belonged. She was no longer a victim seeking protection, but a daughter standing with her father. "So what happens now?" one of the marshals asked. "The girl's got legal claim to one of the biggest fortunes in the territory. The girl," Bon said firmly, "is going to grow up on a ranch in Texas, learning how to rope cattle and fix fence posts and all the other things that matter more than money." Hope grinned up at him. "Can I still keep the inheritance?" "I mean someday when I'm older." "And that's your choice to make," Bon replied. "It's your legacy from the family that loved you. But money doesn't make a person, Hope. Love does. Family does. The choices you make every day do." She considered this wisdom with the seriousness of someone far older than her 12 years. "Then I want to use Marcus and Theodore's money to help other children who don't have families. Children like I was before you found me." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "That sounds like exactly what your parents, all of them, would have wanted." As the federal marshals prepared to leave with their prisoners, Hope did something that would be remembered in Dust Creek for years to come. She walked over to Judge Morrison, who was still looking shamefaced about his role in the day's events. "Judge Morrison," she said formally, "I forgive you for trying to give me back to Uncle Richard. He's very good at fooling people and making them afraid." Morrison knelt down to her level, tears in his eyes. "You're a remarkable young lady, Hope Ransom. Your father, both your fathers, would be proud of the person you're becoming." As the sun climbed higher and the dust from departing horses settled, Bon and Hope stood together in their yard, father and daughter, protector and protected, two souls who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to make a family. The inheritance could wait. The legal proceedings could wait. The future, with all its possibilities and challenges, could wait. For now, it was enough to be home, to be safe, and to be together. Hope's voice had returned just in time to save them all. 6 months later, the new family portrait sat beside the old one on Bon Ransom's mantelpiece. Martha had taken the photograph on a Sunday afternoon when the light was just right, and Hope's laughter had filled the cabin like music. In it, Bon stood tall and proud beside his daughter, legally adopted now, with papers signed by the same Judge Morrison who'd tried to take her away. Hope wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, and a smile that spoke of safety, love, and belonging. But it was the way they looked at each other in that photograph that told the real story. Not like strangers who'd found each other by accident, but like family who'd been meant to find each other all along. The old photograph still held its place of honor. Sarah and Emma frozen in time, their love preserved in sepia tones. But now it wasn't a monument to loss. It was a bridge between the family Bon had mourned and the family he'd been blessed to find again. "Papa, the cattle are getting into the north pasture again," Hope called from the porch, where she'd been watching the herd with the practiced eye of a born rancher. "Well then, I suppose we'd better go move them," Bon replied, settling his hat on his head. "Can't have them eating all the good grass before winter." Hope grinned and ran to fetch her own hat, a smaller version of Bon's that Martha had special ordered from the county seat. At 13 now, she was tall for her age and strong from months of ranch work. Her hands, once soft from a pampered city life, were calloused from rope and leather. Her voice, once stolen by trauma, was clear and confident, but it was her eyes that showed the greatest change. The storm cloud grey was still there, but now it held laughter instead of fear, hope instead of despair. The legal proceedings had taken months to sort out. Richard Kensington was serving life in the territorial prison, his empire dissolved and his crimes exposed in newspapers across the country. The Kensington fortune, both Marcus's rightful inheritance and Theodore's careful investments, had been placed in trust for Hope, to be administered by a panel of federal judges until she came of age. She'd meant what she said about helping other children. Already, 3 orphanages had been established with Kensington money, and a school for children who'd lost their voices to trauma was being built in Denver. Hope visited when she could, bringing hope to others who'd survived the unsurvivable. But her real home was here, on this failing ranch that was failing no more. The Kensington Trust provided enough money to buy proper cattle, fix the fences, and hire help during roundup season. Not enough to be ostentatious, Hope had insisted on that, but enough to make the ranch profitable and secure. "You know," Hope said, as they rode out to move the wayward cattle, "I've been thinking about something." "Dangerous habit," Bon replied with mock seriousness. "What kind of thinking?" "The legal kind. When I turn 18 and get full control of the inheritance, I want to do something special with part of it." "Such as?" Hope was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I want to endow a scholarship fund for children who want to become federal marshals or territorial judges or lawyers. People who can protect others the way Marshal Bradley protected me." Bon smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Even with all the money in the world at her disposal, Hope thought first about helping others. Theodore and Margaret had raised her right, and that foundation of love and values had survived everything Richard had tried to destroy. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing your parents, all of them, would approve of, he said. They worked together in comfortable silence, moving the cattle back to their proper pasture. Hope had become an expert rider and an even better hand with a rope. She read the animals' moods instinctively and could predict which ones would try to break away from the herd. "Papa," she said as they finished the job, "do you ever miss your old life? Before me, I mean. When it was just you and your memories?" The question caught Bon off guard. He studied his daughter's face, seeing genuine concern there. Even after all these months, part of her still feared she was an imposition, a burden he'd taken on out of duty rather than love. "Hope," he said carefully, "before you came, I wasn't living. I was just existing, waiting for my life to end so I could join Sarah and Emma. You didn't interrupt my life, sweetheart. You gave it back to me." She smiled, but he could see she needed more reassurance. "Let me tell you something," Bon continued. "Sarah always said that love doesn't divide when you share it. It multiplies. Loving you doesn't mean I love her and Emma any less. It means my heart grew bigger. And Emma? Do you think she would have liked me?" Bon's throat tightened with emotion. "Emma would have adored you. She always wanted a little sister. And I think maybe she had something to do with bringing you to me. Maybe she asked God to send Papa someone to love, someone who needed loving." Hope's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "I like that idea. That Emma helped me find you." They rode home as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch spread out before them, no longer the failing remnant of better days, but a thriving operation with a future as bright as the sunset. In the distance, Dust Creek was growing too. New families had moved in, drawn by jobs at the expanding cattle operations and the security that came with federal investment in the territory. Martha's general store had doubled in size, and there was talk of building a proper school. "You know what I realized today?" Hope said as they approached the cabin. "What's that?" "I finally understand why they call it hope. Not the feeling, my name. It's not about wishing things were different. It's about believing they can get better, even when everything seems lost." Bon felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. "That's exactly right, daughter. That's exactly what hope means." They unsaddled their horses and turned them out to pasture, then walked together toward the cabin where lamplight glowed warm and welcoming in the windows. On the porch, the wooden horse Emma had loved sat in its place of honor, not forgotten but no longer alone. Inside, supper was waiting on the table Martha had helped prepare before riding back to town. The Bible sat open to Psalms, its pages still holding Hope's drawings, but also pressed flowers from the garden she'd planted that spring. The tin coffee cup waited in its accustomed place, no longer a monument to loss, but a symbol of continuity and love. As they sat down to eat, Hope reached across the table and took Bon's weathered hand in her smaller one. "Thank you, Papa," she said simply, "for saving me, for loving me, "For giving me a home." "Thank you," he replied, "for the same." Outside, the Texas wind sang through the mesquite trees, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but they would face them together, as families do. The new family portrait caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with warmth. Two souls who'd found each other in the darkness, who'd chosen love over fear, hope over despair, family over solitude. Some wounds never heal, Hope had learned, but they can be transformed into something beautiful. Some losses never stop hurting, but they can make room for new love to grow. And sometimes, when you think your story is over, it's really just beginning. In the small cabin at the edge of the Texas wilderness, a giant of a man and the daughter he'd chosen to love sat down to supper, their voices mingling in conversation and laughter as darkness fell gently around their home. They had found each other at last, and they were never letting go.